why is, well, you're making judgments about your students' progress, and those judgments about how your students are progressing inform your practice, in other words, how you're teaching. So if they've got it and they're performing well, then the assumption is, well, you've taught it well, although there's not always a direct relationship between that. If they're not doing well, then maybe you need to go back and reteach or redo or find out where their obstacles to their progress are and incorporate that into your teaching going forward. So that's the why part, and it's all about improving the learning experience. And the how, well, that speaks to strategies, plans, methods, ways of doing assessment. The literature gives us two broad framings for assessment. One is assessment of learning and one is assessment for learning. And I just want to talk about those distinctions, because in the way in which we assess should take account of assessment for learning and also assessment of learning. But we tend to dominate, in the way in which we assess in higher education, we tend to dominate assessment of learning. Our methods tend to fall more into that category than assessment for learning. So let's talk about those two broad distinctions. And we call the one summative, that's the assessment of learning, and the other one is formative, which is the assessment for learning. So let's look at summative, because that's the one that people are most familiar with. That's kind of end of a unit of learning or end of a module of learning where we assess summatively. And so this is about assessing in order to give your students a grade, to see whether they've achieved a certain block of learning, and to make a judgment about, well, can I proceed to the next unit of learning in my module, or can they proceed now from my module to the next module. So it's about making judgments and grading. And so the biggest focus of summative assessment or assessment of learning is the issue of validity. So is what I have assessed that learning in a valid way? And validity is about, well, are we assessing the right things and are we assessing the things right? So if you kind of think about those two things, are we assessing the right things? So the assessment needs to take account of the stuff that they need to know in order to progress, because you're part of a bigger learning program. And are we assessing the things being the knowledge, assuming, or maybe in engineering there's also some practical, are we assessing the things right? Okay, so that's the validity issue. So it's about accuracy and the appropriateness of the assessment. And we put a lot of time and attention when we design some of the assessments into the issue of validity. But there are other issues around assessment as well. You can see that so clearly. So there are issues of fairness, academic integrity, reliability, transparency, and feedback. Those are also important factors that play into a summative assessment, and they play into it in various ways. So the assessment needs to be fair. Now, what do we mean by fairness? The assessment shouldn't discriminate against or favor any group of students in any particular way. So that's what we mean by fairness, and you need to think about, well, what might that mean? So if I'm only using multiple choice as a method, which is very much based on students being able to read those questions and interpret them and understand words, so it's will perhaps advantage, if that's the only method of assessment you use, perhaps advantage students who read very well and have good literacy. If, for example, you are, and I don't think this would be the case in engineering, if the assessment is predominantly oral, then you'd maybe be advantaging students who have the ability to speak and are confident and communicate well to speaking. So that's just one example. You need to think for engineering what would be the criteria for whether your assessment is fair or not, whether it discriminates against one group of students or favors another group. And that's the issue of fairness. So that's one of the things you need to think about when you design your assessment. Another one would be the issue of reliability. And reliability really means consistency. In other words, if I did the same assessment in another set of circumstances, would I get the same or similar result? And usually the system that we have in higher education to ensure reliability is a system of moderation. You're familiar with that? Internal and external moderation. So to check that if you have various people teaching the same module, that you have intermarker reliability, that would be one thing, and so on. So we generally have systems in place to ensure reliability, or we should. Transparency is also important in designing your assessment, and transparency is about, are your students fully informed about this particular assessment. So if it's a really high stakes assessment, do they know upfront how they need to prepare, what they need to prepare? Do they know when it will happen, how it will happen? Have they been given the criteria? If it's a project, for example, have they been given the criteria upfront? Do they know the ways in which they will be judged, in which their performance will be judged? Are you transparent about that? In engineering, do they know how the final mark is calculated? Because that might play an important part as to whether they get the DP. For those who work on DP systems, is there an appeal mechanism, and are students familiar about how they might appeal? Are we transparent about all of those things? So that's what we mean by transparency. So again, are we transparent about how that's calculated, because that gives you entry into the final high stakes assessment. So are we transparent about all of those things? Then integrity, do we have procedures in place to deal with dishonesty, or to make sure that the process has integrity and is honest? And then of course feedback. And feedback plays a bigger role in formative assessments, which I'll talk to you about in a moment. But feedback can also play a role in summative assessments. So often lecturers think, well, it's a summative assessment, it's an end of module assessment, so I don't really need to give my students feedback because they're not coming back. But they might be coming back if they don't make your module. And they are progressing, those who will pass onto something else. So I think one needs to think about ways of giving feedback even on a summative assessment, although it tends to play a smaller role in summative and a much bigger role that we see in a moment in formative. So validity is the big thing with summative assessment, but there are other factors that we need to take into account when we teach this again. Maybe I'll do it differently, or maybe I'll take that into consideration. So there is a space for feedback even in summative assessment, although lots of people think, well, it's the end now, so what's the point in going back and looking at how that a lot of students do. But often the mistakes and the misunderstandings carry from one cohort to another, so we can certainly take that on board and it can impact our teaching. Okay, so let's look at formative. So formative is now what we call assessment for learning. So it's not about grading, it's not about trying to establish whether they are performing and whether they have over knowledge in order to proceed, but rather about measuring their progress. And so your feedback becomes quite an important thing. So the results need to be communicated because it's about taking the next steps towards improvement. And often formative assessment is seen as along the path towards a summative assessment. We do a couple of formative assessments to see whether they're getting there and whether you can track their progress. And so you can see feedback becomes the bigger issue here. The other factors play in as well. So you've got validity, you've got reliability, you've got to be transparent. All those factors play into formative as well. But the thing here is about feedback, because you want them to improve their learning through feedback. So you want to let them know how they're doing. There are a couple of things that are important about formative feedback. One is that it must be good quality. If they don't understand the feedback you're giving them, then it's not going to help them understand what they're not doing right and how to get there. So if we're sort of just giving them vague comments or a little squiggle or a question mark, or, how does the student interpret that feedback? So the feedback must be something that they can use, that they can go away and do something in order to get to the point where you want them to be in order to pass the module. So the quality of the feedback, it must be timeous, so we really want to give them the formative feedback as soon after they've done the formative assessment as possible, because you want them to take that on board before they carry on the next part of the module. So timing is important, and of course it needs to be constructive. So yeah, we're going to criticize, because that's part of the point of feedback, is to critique so that they can know where they're going wrong or what they need to do, but it needs to be presented constructively. So you don't want to crush the poor guy's spirit and make him feel he needs to drop out of this module now. So you want to do it in a constructive way, and if there's something good, which often there is, you also want to point that out before you tell them all the things they need to do differently or what they've done badly. So those are the three important things, and the idea is, well, they need to get a sense. It's like a barometer of where they're at. Are they progressing? Aren't they? Do they need to do something urgently, like, put in a few more tutorials or do some self-study program? Or are they pretty much on just for fun? So imagine you're learning archery in a dark room with all the best equipment, expert coaching, but you're shooting literally in the dark, getting no feedback about your performance. The current situation with student learning and assessment is like that, except the lights are turned on after the training of archers is done. So they sit the test and they go. Scores are recorded and sent to the archer's sponsor. It might be, she says, that there is a case for having even a dim light on while the archer is flying. Imagine what a difference that might make to the archery. Okay, so let's take the archery metaphor and apply it to our own assessment. So often that's the case. They do the assessment, it really is not very transparent, what's being assessed, why, all of those things. And then complete the assessment, and then we switch on the lights and we assess and we mark. So the dim light that we can shine on our students' progress is through the formative feedback. That's the dim light that we can shine. So that they can know where they're heading in your want to do. So that's the summary. So we've got the formative, we've got the summative, the one is assessment for learning, the one is of learning, so the end of, and while we're in progress, measuring while they're in progress, while they're learning and measuring attainment at the end. The one, the results are communicated as grades or marks, and the other one is communicated as feedback. So the mark is not as important as the qualitative feedback we get when we're learning. And the one that is getting to make judgment by passing or failing, and the other one is to plan next steps for improvement for the students in terms of your learning, but also for yourself in terms of your teaching. The backdrop for all of that I've spoken to this morning is our SU assessment policy, and the policy has 7 criteria. So we've spoken about validity, reliability, fairness, transparency, academic integrity, and feedback. We're talking about those. One of the 7 criteria for good assessment, which is in our policy, speaks to achievability. Now I haven't put that up on the slide, but achievability is really your reality check. It's saying, well, we need all those criteria and principles in place if we're designing good assessments for our students, but it needs to be achievable, and that's the balance. Okay, so you can have an elaborate assessment plan that does all these wonderful things, but if you don't have the time or the resources to make it happen, then it remains just an elaborate plan. So those 6 criteria you always have to balance against your reality. Is it achievable, or how can I make it achievable without compromising the principles of good assessment?